Hello, it's Simon Zutshi here, and I'm joined by Ranjan Bhattacharya. And in this video, we're going to be talking about the truth about purchase lease options. There's a whole load of stuff on the internet, most of which is incorrect, saying, can options be done? Are they legal? Can you finance? So we're going to set the record straight and say exactly what you can and can't do with this really powerful investing tool.
Now, I think one of the biggest problems with videos on the internet about lease options is that often they're done by people who haven't done them. If you want to find out about the truth about lease options, you really need to talk to some people that have actually done it. I've done a few in the commercial arena, and I'm joined by Simon Zutshi, who's done several in the residential arena and also teaches the subject and is quite a specialist on the subject. Simon, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Ranjan. Yes, I don't think I'm an expert, to be honest, on purchase, but I've done purchase options. I understand them, and I've also been able to teach many other people who've also very successfully done purchase options. And I can tell you that when done in the correct way, they are a very powerful tool. The biggest mistake I see people make is they're trying to use this very powerful tool, but in just completely the wrong circumstances. Thus, the seller doesn't really want to do it. And people make the incorrect assumption that options don't work. That's not correct. It's maybe they're not working them in the correct way. So hopefully we can set the record straight, really help people watching this video who want to learn how to use this powerful tool.
Okay, before we get into that, what is a lease option? Tell people what they are.
Okay, so there's two fundamental types. There's a purchase option and there's a purchase lease option. So a purchase option is where you get the right to buy something at a point in the future for a fixed price. The way you might use it, for example, they're used very commonly in development, commercial property, and to a lesser extent in residential property. So let's say someone's got a piece of land and you want to buy the piece of land to develop it. Well, buying it without planning permission could be very risky. Mm-hmm. So what you go and you agree a purchase price you're happy with and the owner's happy with, they give you a period of time in which you can actually exercise the option to buy the piece of land. You would use that time to get your planning permission. Once your planning is in place, you're happy to buy the piece of land. And it's just a great way of securing, to make sure that you don't want to get planning and then the owners decide, you know what, I'm not going to sell to you, I'm going to sell to someone else. So it's just a very common tool used particularly in property development.
You can't use it in Scotland?
No, Scotland, you can't do it. And there's a couple of states in Australia and a couple of states in America where you can't do it as well. But most of the world, you can do purchase options, correct? Then a purchase lease option just has that extra word lease in it. And most people know lease means kind of rent. So what it means is, same thing, you have the right to buy a property at a price you agree today, sometime within the option period. By the way, you always put down a consideration. You must buy that option, typically £1, but it might be several £1,000s, depending what it is. But a lease option is where you also get to use the asset in the meantime, and you pay a monthly fee to the owner for that. So you probably wouldn't do it on a piece of land, but let's say you want to buy a house that is being used as an HMO. And maybe the landlord is fed up of being a landlord, or they're a remote landlord, they're not really filling it properly. And you can take away that problem because you might be local, you know what you're doing. And what you do is you'd have the right to buy that property. Let's say it's a £200,000 property now. You might have the right to buy it for that price anytime in the next 5 years. In the meantime, you would take the property on. You give the landlord a guaranteed rental income, not the full rent they get. You need to make a profit as well, but enough to cover their mortgage, cover their tax. You take on the bills, give them a profit as well. And the whole point is you're taking the hassle away from them and you're making a margin on the rent as well. So it's a great strategy to get cash flow and also potential equity growth on a property that you don't own, but you control through this purchase lease option agreement.
Yes, yes. I mean, in the past, I found it a very valuable tool when you're dealing with retiring landlords, for example, if you're picking up a small portfolio, because it allows you then to exercise you get control of the asset straight away, but exercise your options to purchase them in a staged manner, often after you've refurbished them one by one to get the uplifted value.
That is a classic way of using a purchase option. And in fact, you'd have an individual option on each of the properties, so you can exercise them at the time you want. And if you think about it, these don't work all the time. You want to have this as a solution when it's a great win-win for you and also for the seller. And the reason that works so well, Ranjan, is because if you have a small portfolio of property and you get to the point where you want to retire, if you sold all your properties in 1 or maybe 2 years, you'd obviously pay a lot of capital gains tax. If you can phase the sales over a number of years, you can use your personal capital gains tax allowance each year, which at the moment is £12,000. If it's in joint names with your partner, it'd be £24,000. So you could sell a property a year, get the first £24,000 completely tax-free. And if you're a high rate taxpayer, that's a nice amount of money to get tax-free. So this is a way of reducing the amount of tax you pay. What you could say is, well, the landlord could hang around till the last property sold, but that might mean years and years and years, where actually they could go and sit on a beach. You take on the responsibility to look after their property. And you do need to look after their properties. We'll come back to that later. But the whole point is you take on the responsibility. You look after them. They can go away and forget about it. And here's the other benefit for landlords. Ranjan, I'm sure you'd agree with me. Current market conditions, if someone wants to sell a house right now, a property, they're probably not going to get the full price. Would you agree?
Yeah.
As an investor, we'd want to go and buy at a discount, obviously. Well, because we're not buying now, because we're buying in the future, and it might be 3, 5, 7 years' time, we can maybe offer them the full asking price right now. Let's say it's worth 200. We give them the 200 because in the future, that might be a discounted price. It might be worth 220, 250. It might only be worth 200. It might be worth 190. But the point is there could be some capital growth. So we're getting a discount in the future, but giving them the full value now, which is more than they would get if they sold to someone else and got the money right now.
That's an interesting point because that kind of, the way I've applied lease options is where in scenarios where I'm actually not looking for natural capital appreciation to get my uplift to realize the option. I'm always looking at something that I am doing to realize an uplift in value in a shorter period, and then exercising the option on the increased value that I have added rather than the rising market. Because I find that squeezes the timelines a little bit. And
yeah, there's no guarantee that the market's going to go up. You know, market's putting a decline now for a year or so, and then the long-term trend in the UK is obviously up because of supply and demand and macroeconomics. But absolutely, I completely agree. If you could buy a house, so you might find something that's a 3-bed house right now, and you can convert it into a 6-bed HMO, adding significant value. You might only want the option for a year or two to actually get that work done and then bring it back. The other thing is, if you are buying a property in an Article 4 area where permitted development rights have been removed to turn a C3 normal house into a C4 HMO, it's risky buying that property. So you could just get a purchase option just for the time to get the planning permission. Once you've got that, you actually then buy the property, or you do the work, then you buy it. So I completely agree. Always where possible, you want to add value.
Yes. Now, there's a whole lot of, you alluded to in the beginning, a nonsense on the internet. And I think a lot of it is that some people, it's like if I get a toolbox with a spanner and I try to do every DIY job with just my spanner. I need a toolbox for different types of problems. Exactly. And this doesn't work in all scenarios, is it?
No, of course it doesn't. And let me make it really easy for everyone watching this video to identify and understand when it would work and when it wouldn't work. Mm-hmm. So in principle, we're looking for someone who is interested in selling their property. It might be already on the market. It might not be on the market yet, but they're thinking about doing it. And we know that lots of long-term landlords have been landlords for 15, 20 years, and they all own property in their own name typically. Because of Section 24, we're seeing more landlords than ever before coming forward looking to retire early because they're getting whacked by paying more tax because of Section 24. So we know that's a fact. We know that's happening. Not all landlords, but a good proportion, more than usual. If you want to find someone who's looking to sell a property, ideally. Now, when someone's looking to sell a property, there are 2 groups of people. The first group of people are people who are selling that property because they need to get the equity in the property for something else. Maybe they're paying down their own home mortgage, or they're clearing some other debt, or they want to invest in a new business, or they want to buy some different property, or they want to pay for their daughter's wedding. So they need the money. And that's the vast majority of people who are selling.
Or their son's wedding, of course.
Or their son's wedding, of course. Absolutely. Not wanting to be apolitical or anything. But the other group of people, group two, are people who are selling a property, and there might be some equity, there may not be equity, but they're selling it because they don't really want it. It could be a property that's been inherited. It's the other side of the country. They don't want it. It could be a landlord who's retiring. It could be someone who's emigrating out of the country. All sorts of reasons. They just don't want that property. And actually, when they sell the property, they don't need the money. And that's the most important thing, because with an option, they're not necessarily getting the money now. They're getting the money at some point in the future. So if they're in group one and they're selling because they need the money to pay for their son's wedding, well, if you go and say, I'll buy it in 5 years' time, that's obviously not going to work for them. But if they're in group two, and if there is some equity and they're just going to put the money in the bank, we all know that money in the bank is pretty much losing money, because it's the interest you get is less than inflation right now. Actually, we could offer them a better solution, as well as giving them a higher price than they might achieve right now. We could make sure that we give them more money each month over and above the cost of the mortgage, if there is a mortgage, than they'd get in the bank. So they've got a double win here. And a great question I will ask them I would say, is it important for you to sell the house as quick as possible and get the money, or would you like to get as much money as you can from this property? So I'm suggesting, if I'm going to buy at a discount, or if you want more money, I can actually give you more money if you're flexible on the terms of the sale.
Yes, that is absolutely key. So it's about making sure when the vendor actually needs the money. So it's all about finding out what problem the vendor has, if they have a problem at all.
Yes, and that's always the way. I think if you're wanting to find an ethical win-win solution, all too often we as humans, we make assumptions. We assume we know what people want. And actually asking really good questions can help elicit the situation and the problem they're in, and then we can come up with the most appropriate solution. As you say, we can get the correct tool from the toolbox. If it's a spanner, if it's a screwdriver, it's the hammer, whatever it is, rather than trying to bash everything with a spanner because it looks like a great tool.
Brilliant. Now, Simon, I want to ask you about something, because there are some ways that lease options are practiced which don't gel that well with me. I see a lot of people talk about, they're basically encouraging you to take on a property on a lease option in some hellhole up north, where it's been in negative equity for the last decade, based on some wing and a prayer that suddenly prices are going to go up in the next decade. I don't see that happening. What do you think?
Right. Well, I agree with you. I'm very nervous about that. No one knows what's going to happen to property prices in the future. We anticipate that prices should go up. But as we know, we saw in 2008 crisis, prices come down. It's going to happen again right now, I personally believe. And so, I think that's very dangerous. People sometimes think that purchase options only work in negative equity, because that's the only reason someone would agree to it. Let's say a property is worth 100,000 and their mortgage is 120,000, and there are plenty of properties in negative equity all around the country, as you quite rightly say, particularly up north, because I think prices were very high in 2007. Valuations are very high. People probably paid too much for property all over the country at that time. The market crashed, and most of the country has recovered, and most places prices are higher than they were in 2007, but not everywhere. And also in 2007, you might remember this, Ranjan, I'm sure you do, is that if people were buying a property, in certain circumstances, you could get as much as 125% mortgage. So let's say a property was 200,000. The mortgage company might lend you 250,000 for that. Now, some people took the extra money and bought property, but some people spent it on cars, boats, holidays. Not a very wise thing to do. So even in the southeast, there are still some properties that are actually in negative equity. But you're right, generally it's up north where prices are way too high. They all crashed down and haven't quite recovered yet. So some people who teach options would say, well, go and find someone in negative equity and they'll be really happy to sell you their house that's only worth 100,000 for 120 in 5-10 years time. Now, whilst you might get some cash flow from that, it's very unlikely that property is going to go up in value. So it's very unlikely you're actually going to buy it. And from my standpoint, I think to be ethical, you only really want to enter into a purchase option or a purchase option if you genuinely intend to buy the property. Now, the thing is, you don't have to buy. You've got the right, but not the obligation to do. But I think if you go in, you generally want to. And if you don't buy and you hand the property back to the owner, you should give it to them in the same as or even better condition than when they first gave it to you, so they don't lose out at all.
I think you're absolutely right, but I think the other problem is that with the low value areas, and these are characterized by high unemployment and basically job prospects which keep prices low and rents low, and the kind of tenant base, not the best tenants in the world.
They're just not going to get the capital growth, are they?
You're not going to get capital growth, but let's say you've got a lease option which allows you to exercise in 5 years. In that 5 years, the property will need refurbishing and keeping up to spec. You haven't got the cash flow there to do it. And if it's still in negative equity in year 3, you already know you're not going to exercise the option. So it's just a cycle of decline and hassle.
I agree. Yes, I agree. Yeah. So I think if a property is in negative equity, the only time that I would do that is if it was in an area that did typically have much better capital growth. And I wouldn't want to do it negative equity in a poor area. I just wouldn't touch it personally. And I don't think anyone should.
Okay, let's just both of us share some examples of lease options, option successes, if you like. Let's go with you first, Simon.
So let me give you a couple of, just do one example now. And this, I'll give you one study. I'll tell you why I like this study so much. So it's a guy called Josh, who's living in Oxford. So Oxford's a very expensive area, so not a cheap slum area that doesn't have growth, something that has very good capital growth. And he found this option by doing what we teach, which is tell everyone what you do. And he actually had a part-time job working in M&S. And he used to stack the shelves, but also what he used to do was he would help people. Sorry?
Did he stack the deals?
No. he would help people who need assistance shopping. And he was pushing this one lady, Jo, a regular client. And he'd just done some training with us, and we said to him, look, tell everyone what you do. And she said, how are you? What are you doing? And he said, I've got this brilliant new hobby. She said, what's that? He said, I help people who need to sell their houses, and I help investors get a great return on their money. And she looked at him and said, really? And he said, yeah. He said, maybe you could help. She said, what do you mean? He said, well, my landlord is looking to sell my property, and I've lived there years and years. I really don't want to sell it. I really don't want to have to move, and maybe you could buy his house. Turned out this was a large HMO in Oxford. Now, the rationale of the owner was he had this property. He's had it for years. They're getting a bit old. He used to look after it, do all the maintenance, all the management, and he just had enough. He just didn't want to do it anymore, okay? So Josh went round and had a conversation with the guy, asked him great questions, found out what was going on, explained what he wanted to do. So, look, I'd like to buy it, but maybe in a few years. In the meantime, you said you don't want to manage. I can take that on for you. And the guy said, well, I'd need at least £3,000 a month, to which Josh said, well, we need to look at the numbers. Maybe we can do that. Now, what I haven't told you, this is a 13-bed HMO in Oxford. Mm-hmm. So they agreed a price and a 5-year option. Josh pays £3,000 to the owner, which might make a lot of people scared in the first place. This is a valuable property, though, £3,000 a month. Josh then pays all the bills, but he collects the rent, which is just over, I think it's $5,200 when it's fully let. And after all the bills, Josh makes about £1,500 profit on this property. It was already set up as an HMO. He spent a couple of £1,000 just tidying it up a little bit. It was almost fully let. There were 2 empty rooms. He tidied up. He's now rent those out pretty easily. So he makes £1,500 a month. That's £18,000 a year on a property he doesn't own, on a property he's not had to put a deposit into, on a property he doesn't have a mortgage on. And the thing I haven't told you yet, the reason the option worked really well is because Josh, when he did this deal, was 17. He couldn't even buy a property, couldn't get a mortgage, even if he had the deposit. So my point is, once you know how to do this properly, and the circumstances obviously work for the seller, if a 17-year-old could do it, what's stopping any adult who's watching this video doing it, as long as they know what they're doing?
It's having the idea that it's possible.
Yeah, the belief that it's possible. If you think something's not possible, you're absolutely right. You'll never be able to do it.
And then it's coming across a scenario where you're receptive to the vendor's circumstances and you know that you can apply that particular solution.
Yes.
And then it's about knowing the mechanics to see it through. I mean, like yourself, I've seen many of these sort of lease option type of arrangements and option type of arrangements. One project that I did some time ago was basically a guy had converted a building into a block of flats. He didn't have planning permission for it, but it had been in place for more than 7-8 years. The guy actually lived in Greece, so he wasn't, in tune with it. So the long and short of it is we had structured it as a lease option. So we had the option to purchase it. We actually paid him the lease amount, which was the same rent that he was getting from the existing flat. So we didn't make anything margin on it. But our thing was to get a certificate of lawful use, because he furnished us with all the records to prove that the property had been used as multiple flats for the last 5-6 years. I can't remember how long, but much more than the 4-year minimum. So we then collected that information, scanned it, got the planning consultant in, got the certificate of lawful use. And based on that enhanced value, because it had legal permission for the use as flats, we were able to exercise the option to purchase. I've got a student of mine who is looking to buy a shop. Again, direct-to-vendor marketing technique, sending out letters to people. This guy is retiring and he wants to sell his shop. So the upper parts of the shop are unused. So he used to trade from the shop. He's got a manager in there now who's running the shop. And basically he's got the shop down to the ground floor, so the upper parts aren't used. So what my student has done is done the option to purchase at a future point in time. There's no rent involved, because basically whatever rent the manager is giving is going sort of directly to the landlord. But what he's going to be doing is implementing his Class G permitted development rights to make 2 flats above the shop. So once that permission is there and is done, because it's separate access, it won't affect the trading of the shop, he can then complete on the purchase of the whole building, offering a much higher price than the guy can get now. So he knows that you can put 2 flats above, but he can't be bothered to do it himself. But he's being cut in for the slice of the pie by the guy who's doing the work, if that makes sense.
And that's a key thing that I think a lot of people miss. If someone could just find someone who's going to come along and buy the property and give them all the cash, most people would obviously do that. Obviously. But we're looking for people where actually an option or a purchase option can actually give them a better solution than a straightforward purchase. And that's when it works particularly well.
Yes. So I think it's like with everything. Things can be done in a bad way if you don't know what you're doing and you don't know how to apply it.
If you put someone who's, I remember, I don't drive because I've got really bad eyesight, but I remember when I was at school, everyone when they were 17 just getting their licenses and driving. And in the sixth form common, there was a chart on the wall of how many days after people getting their license did they crash their car. And it was filling up quite a lot. It was almost like this kind of expected this would happen, right? Because they didn't have the experience. They often didn't really know what they were doing. Those people who are now our age, well, they don't have accidents anymore because they know what they're doing. And so anything you do, you can either do it in a correct way or you can do it in a wrong way. And by getting education, that's a great start. And then actually you learn through experience of actually doing as well.
Now, I've always found that options, lease options, unless you're doing pure development deals, that's land development, all of that, leave that aside, but options on buildings that exist, should we say?
Yes.
I've always found that those propositions are far easier to do when the market is cooler and in recessionary period than when it's boom, 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 boom. I found it very, very difficult because there are too many people around with cash willing to do it anyway. Yes. Do you find any difference in the appetite for doing these deals depending on where you are in the market cycle?
I completely agree. If the market's booming and there are buyers lining up to give you cash, there's not so much reason why a seller would do an option. Although, having said that, because based on what I said earlier, you can actually give someone a bit more money, okay? But when the market slows and there aren't as many buyers around, the sellers don't have as many options. And I think they open up to more creative solutions, whether it's a purchase lease option or vendor finance thing, all of the things which are difficult but possible to do in the right circumstances. So I completely agree with you. That's why back in the last crash in 2009, when actually it was kind of hard to get finance because the reason we had the crash was because the global credit crunch. Lenders didn't really want to lend. It was difficult to lend then. And you know what, Ranjan, I see the market coming down. I see lenders are lending right now, but they've increased their rates. They've lowered their loan to value. And guess what? If you're a portfolio landlord with more than 4 properties, they can look at your entire portfolio, look at the loan to value, look at the rent coverage, etc. And it might be harder for people to get mortgages going forward for the next 6 or 12 months. I don't know, but that's my guess. In which case, if there's lots of people wanting to sell and people can't actually buy, options might be a very appropriate strategy for the next 12 months.
And I find one other thing that changes when the market softens and we go through a recessionary period is this. What seems to happen is that people that have been in the game a long time, they know that the market cycle takes a long time to go through the mill. So it takes about a decade or so. Yeah. So if you're of a certain age, then how long do you have to wait before the next peak? You tend to find that more people come out of the woodwork who have held their property for a couple of cycles. They know they've made compared to when they've purchased it. But they know that they don't really want to hang on for the next decade or whatever, for the next peak to get all their cash out of a deal, if you like. They want something else. So I find that certain vendors change their psychology and change their receptiveness to these sort of strategies at these times. And they would not have considered it, say, 2 years ago.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. And add into the fact that actually now people are starting to see the impact of Section 24. The first time was in January 2019 when they had to do their tax returns for the first time. And they looked at their tax return and think, oh my God, why am I paying this extra tax? And the accountant would said, oh, that's Section 24. And it's going to get worse the next 3 years. And this year was the second year of it where it's 50% implemented. And it's going to get worse over the next 2 years. And I think people, particularly who saw the market crash in 2008, 2009, and remember that, might think, you know what, actually, maybe I should get out now because exactly what you just said. They don't want to wait another 10 years paying all this extra tax, and actually selling over the next couple of years might be far more attractive to them.
So when I talk about the lease options that I've done and my students have done, we're pretty much talking in the commercial property context, where we're dealing with vendors who are commercially aware. They own commercial property, they own businesses, if you like. We're using commercial solicitors and we're using commercial financing. And of course, the whole concept of lease options was born in the arena of commercial property. And I think one of the areas of confusion and, if you like, inappropriate use of lease options has been when it's been tried to be applied to the residential arena. So, Simon, let's just have a talk about how this applies when you're dealing with residential homeowners and normal solicitors and normal financing, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think there's a distinction between a residential homeowner and a landlord who has a rental property. There's a big difference there. First of all, a landlord, like in commercial property, is probably going to be a bit more commercially aware. They may or may not have heard of purchase lease options, not that you ever use those words, but they're more savvy than a normal home owner. Okay, that's the first thing. And you're absolutely right, Ranjan. This has come out of commercial property. Most commercial surveyors will understand about options. Most residential conveyancing solicitors, whether it's a home or a rental property, they might not have heard about it. And so people often they might secure a deal, go to their solicitor who doesn't know whether to, and says, and solicitors sometimes, if they don't know about something, their stock answer is, oh, I don't know if that sounds legal. I don't think you should do that. It's almost their stock answer, really. The fact is that, you can do it within residential property. And I think actually rental property is the best to go for because, as we said, the owner is more commercially savvy. They're going to have a buy-to-let mortgage, whereas if you can do options with homeowners, but you want to make sure they completely understand what they're getting into. We always recommend that you as the investor and the property owner, whether they're a landlord or a homeowner, they must have independent legal advice so know exactly what they're getting into. And the solicitor's duty of care will make them aware, look, you're agreeing to sell this house for £200,000 within a certain time frame. It might be worth significantly more, but you're only going to get 200. And that's a sign. Say, yes, I understand. I'm happy. We're not trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes. We're trying to find a solution that's better for them than the other solution, basically. So I always prefer dealing with landlords. And also, because they've got the right kind of mortgage. If you did do a home, you need to get consent to let from the lenders, obviously, to make sure the house is used appropriately. Always use the right solicitors. So it's important to get ones that actually understand it and have worked with other solicitors who understand it as well. And the final thing, I guess, in relation to this is the financing. Now, let's say a property is worth, you've got a right to buy for 200 and it's worth 250 after 5-7 years. Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of people think, well, if it's worth 250, I'd like to buy it based on the value of 250, get a mortgage on that. But that's not going to happen. If you're actually buying at 200,000, that's what goes on land registry, and you would get a normal buy-to-let mortgage based on the purchase price of 200. So you get a mortgage for say 150, put 50 deposit in. That's the way you would do it. There is a challenge sometimes. Some lenders, some buy-to-let lenders, they don't like supporting investors buying property if the property is at a big discount, because they worry that the seller might be a distressed seller and they don't want to be associated with below market value purchases. It's slightly ironic, really, because if a property owner is not paying the mortgage company are very happy to repossess them and sell it cheap to another investor, which is a little bit hypocritical, really, but that's the way the market goes. But we've had lots of clients who purchased options. Sometimes they've exercised it, sometimes using commercial lenders, sometimes they use bridging and then they'll refinance it. It really depends which way and what's happening in the mortgage market at that particular time.
That's absolutely correct. I mean, again, I found it a lot easier because I use commercial lawyers, commercial vendors, commercial solicitors, financing for commercial properties. But with residential properties, I think a lot of the times people try to get a hole in one. There's no need to, the financing you get is not your final financing. Use that get the ball near to the green with the bridging, and then do the end financing 6 months later or whatever, and you're home and dry.
That's exactly it.
And factor it all into the deal, the extra costs of doing so. Yeah.
Sometimes people try and get this perfect goal, and that's why they keep on missing. And there are stages in which you do these things. In a similar way, sometimes you get planning, you get that in stages as well. And that's where I guess the knowledge and expertise comes into play. So you've got to learn how to do these things correctly.
Okay, so lease options then. Doing lease options in the current market, what would be your 3 quick-fire tips for success?
Okay, so the first tip is only use it when it's an appropriate tool. Okay, that's the most, and what I mean by that is, for example, the seller doesn't need the money right now. So that's the most important thing. Secondly, doing a lease option has to be the best alternative for that seller rather than selling it at another price, whatever it might be. And the third tip is don't try and be too greedy. If you've got someone who's prepared to sell you this property some point in the future, and in the meantime you take it on and make cash flow, don't try and be too tight on the price you're going to pay them. Pay them a fair price to make it a win-win ethical deal for you and for them.
Now, of course, both Simon and I talk a lot about lease options and a fair amount of experience in it. I know, Simon, you offer some quite in-depth training on the subject and have done this for a number of years. We're going to put some links below in the description for this video. But what will they learn by clicking on that link?
Well, so we run a 90-minute webinar where we go through the principles about, why actually options are a great strategy, particularly in the current market. how to identify them, how to negotiate them, and give people a really good understanding. And then obviously if they want to come and do further training, they can come and do that, but at least they get some information completely free. And because it's a live webinar, they get the chance to ask questions and get some of those questions answered.
And there's some case studies there as well, aren't there?
We have lots of case studies with people who've done it with HMOs in development, all sorts of things. Yes, so they can really relate to the kind of deals they're looking to do.
That's the missing link often, because often, you know, the theory looks fine on a slide, but you need to actually digest it through going through step by step some detailed case studies before it actually sinks in.
Learning from case studies, I think, is one of the best ways to learn, because it takes the theory and it makes it real. And the fact that someone else has done it, well, it means obviously it's possible to do. And that helps people with their own personal belief of maybe actually I can do this. And one of the biggest challenges people have is understanding why on earth would a seller grant an option to someone. And it's because they're not stepping into their shoes and understanding the situation from the seller's point of view and trying to find a better solution than the alternative they have.
Thanks very much for joining me, Simon. It's been brilliant.
Thank you, Ranjan, for asking. I really appreciate it. And I hope people got a bit more insight into this powerful tool that can be used to become an even more successful investor.
We're trying to keep it real, trying to cut out the spin and tell you what's really happening in the property market from people who are actually doing the strategies that they are talking about.
So Ranjan, thank you so much for coming on to this video and onto the YouTube channel to share your experience of how you've been able to use options in the commercial world, which has been really valuable. Guys, if you like this video, please hit the like button. Make sure you subscribe to the channel as well. And also click the little bell icon, which means you're going to get notified when new videos come up. Also, we'd love to hear your comments about options and purchase options. What do you think? Type them in the question box below. And if you've actually done option deals, again, tell us what you've done and how you've done them, just to help inspire other people who are watching this that they can actually do it as well. So as ever, I encourage you to invest with knowledge, invest with skill. See you in the next video.